Lydia, an enslaved woman in Kentucky, set fire to her mistress in the bridal chamber on her wedding night. It was an act so startling, so deliberate, that it carved her name into the whispered history of the South. Her role had long been confined to the shadows of servitude, her days marked by labor and submission. Yet in one calculated moment, she transformed the symbols of her bondage into instruments of fire. The mistress, adorned in finery, prepared to enter a life of privilege and respectability. The bridal chamber, decorated for union, love, and social elevation, became instead the stage for destruction. Lydia's decision was neither random nor reckless. It was chosen with precision, and the cruelty of its timing burned just as hot as the flames themselves. The night that should have been filled with vows and celebrations was rewritten in fire. The chamber, thick with expectation, was suddenly consumed by smoke and heat. The irony was impossible to ignore. A bride entering matrimony only to meet death in the very room meant to sanctify her future. Viewers can almost see the curtains catching, the air filling with choking black, the screams cutting through what should have been laughter. Lydia's hand had redirected the course of the evening from joy to terror, leaving no space for misunderstanding. This was not an accident, nor was it the misfortune of a stray ember. It was a rebellion made visible. And in that transformation, Lydia became more than a name on a slaveholder's ledger. She became a figure both feared and remembered. Her act stood as a shocking declaration that within the most controlled spaces, resistance could still erupt. To the enslaved, it whispered the possibility that even in chains, one could still strike at the heart of oppression. To the masters, it confirmed their darkest fear, that their households, their rituals, even their most intimate chambers were never entirely safe. The bridal chamber burned as a cruel inversion of everything it symbolized. Marriage was meant to secure alliances, wealth, and the next generation of white heirs. Instead, it was engulfed in smoke, its sanctity violated by the hand of the very person meant to serve within it. Lydia's fire turned the centerpiece of aristocratic pride into a charred reminder of slavery's fragile order. The scene carried a heavy symbolism that outlived the flames. Each retelling fixed Lydia not as a faceless figure lost in bondage, but as a woman who dared to strike back in the one place her mistress thought untouchable. This act, horrifying in its immediacy, lingered because of what it represented. It was not only the death of a mistress, but the desecration of a ceremony meant to secure family power. The chamber that should have glowed with candles of celebration, instead blazed with a defiance that history could not easily silence. Lydia's name, tied to that fire, forced Kentucky and beyond to reckon with the truth. Even the most powerless could unleash terror within the heart of privilege. Her legacy begins here in that room, on that night, when fire devoured lace and vows, when the illusion of order was torn apart by a single enslaved woman's decision to burn her mistress alive. Lydia's act was horrifying, unforgettable, and symbolic, a scar etched into memory, never to fade. To understand the weight of her act, we must first step into the world that surrounded her, the strange, conflicted, and brutal society of slavery in Kentucky. Unlike the cotton kingdoms of Mississippi or Alabama, Kentucky carried a different face of bondage. It sat on the border, caught between the free North and the slaveholding South. But make no mistake, was still built upon chains. The soil may not have yielded endless cotton fields, but human lives were still measured in property, obedience, and control. In this borderland, slavery often took on a domestic shape. Enslaved women like Lydia were kept close, their lives bound to kitchens, chambers, and parlors. Every movement was watched, every word is measured. Unlike the wide-open plantations of the Deep South, here the whip and the command echoed inside homes, in narrow hallways, and behind closed doors. That intimacy created a suffocating presence. To be enslaved in Kentucky was to have your very breath monitored. your body constantly within reach of your master or mistress. And so the bridal chamber, decorated in lace and ceremony, was more than a room. It was a shrine to Southern pride, a display of wealth and control. Weddings in Kentucky's slaveholding households were staged to prove status, to secure alliances, and to display mastery over both land and people. Every curtain, every candle, every piece of furniture carried meaning. For the enslaved, those very symbols became reminders of the distance between freedom and bondage. Lydia moved through these spaces daily, unseen yet ever present. Her silence demanded, her labor expected. Kentucky's contradictions made her act even sharper. This was not Mississippi, where rebellion was often tied to fields of labor. This was a border state, where slavery lived under the constant gaze of a world debating its existence, yet clinging fiercely to its chains. Here, resistance had to come from within the household itself, from the very places meant to symbolize harmony and order. When Lydia set her fire, she did not just strike against a single woman. She struck against the architecture of Kentucky's peculiar world, a society that insisted it was gentler, even as it crushed lives with the same cruelty as the Deep South. The irony is thick. A chamber built to celebrate love and continuity instead became the site of defiance. A household meant to embody stability collapsed into terror in one night. For enslaved women living under constant surveillance, this act was a message. Even in the most controlled spaces, rebellion could flicker, waiting for the right moment to ignite. By understanding Kentucky's slaveholding world, we see Lydia's fire not as random madness, but as a calculated eruption within a society that thought itself untouchable. The very symbols that masters prized, marriage, ceremony, household order, were turned into ashes. Her act was both uniquely tied to Kentucky's domestic slavery and universally tied to the cruelty of bondage itself. In the silence of those halls, in the weight of that chamber, her fire found its stage. Lydia, an enslaved woman in Kentucky, set fire to her mistress in the bridal chamber on her wedding night. Before that night of flames and defiance, her life was marked by years of servitude. A quiet existence lived under the crushing weight of ownership. The historical record offers only fragments of her name and her act, yet those fragments carry the echo of an entire life spent in bondage. Lydia's story, like so many others, was not written by her hand, but by the system that sought to erase her voice while extracting her labor. Her days were shaped by work that never ended. Dawn to dusk, tasks were assigned, repeated, and enforced with the certainty of chains. There was no choosing, no resting, no moment truly her own. Enslavement meant not only toil but also constant surveillance. Every step Lydia took was someone else's to command. Every breath carried the knowledge that her body did not belong to her. That reality, yielding and humiliating, was the foundation of her life. To live as Lydia did was to exist in a world where dignity was stripped piece by piece. Enslaved women endured not just physical labor, but personal indignity, spoken commands that cut like whips, punishments that enforced silence, laws that denied their humanity. Identity itself was stolen, replaced with property status, recorded in ledgers rather than remembered as a person. Lydia's very presence in that household was both expected and ignored, essential yet dismissed, visible only when her labor was required. This was the rhythm of her existence: to serve without question, to labor without recognition, to endure without relief. Each day reinforced the message that her life was not hers to live, and yet within that silence, a pressure built. To be bound so tightly, to be denied so completely, created a tension that could not last forever. Even in the smallest corners of her reality, the system's cruelty made rebellion not only possible, but inevitable. The power of Lydia's story lies in that contrast. On one hand, her life in servitude represents thousands of enslaved women whose names never made it into history books. On the other, her act of fire reminds us that those same women denied autonomy, carried within them the capacity for defiance. The silence of her daily life was not absence, it was the steady, grinding weight of oppression, pressing until it broke. By looking at Lydia's servitude, we do not see a faceless figure. We see a woman who lived under relentless control, whose every moment was shaped by bondage. That truth matters, because without understanding the burden she carried, the blaze she unleashed cannot be understood. Her fire was not born in a single moment, but in years of living as property, of being denied the simplest dignity of self. Lydia's backstory does not offer spectacle. It offers reality, the slow, grinding cruelty of slavery. And it is from that reality that her extraordinary act would later erupt, shocking the world that thought her silent forever in the confines of the household. It was not only masters who wielded power. Mistresses, cloaked in lace and propriety, often carried the sharper edge of cruelty. For Lydia, the mistress she served was not a distant figure of authority, but a constant presence, watching, judging, and punishing. She lived under this gaze, trapped in a world where a woman who should have understood vulnerability instead became its enforcer. The mistress's authority began in the parlor, stretched into the kitchen, and pressed deep into the quarters where Lydia slept. Every task, from the smallest chore to the heaviest burden, was dictated by her will. Here lay one of slavery's cruelest ironies. A white woman, herself legally bound to her husband's name and reputation, grasped at power by asserting dominance over the enslaved. She directed her frustrations downward, and Lydia bore the weight. This pattern was not unusual, it repeated across plantations and towns, where mistresses became both jailers and rivals to the women they claimed to control. Mistresses guarded their homes fiercely. They patrolled conduct, dress, and even the faintest sign of independence among the enslaved. Lydia, like countless others, likely felt the sting of reprimands that cut far deeper than words. To the mistress, discipline was a tool, not an exception. Acts of correction, whether petty or harsh, were woven into daily life, teaching obedience while erasing dignity. And beneath it all, there simmered a tension unique to the bond between mistress and enslaved woman, a relationship sharpened by jealousy, fear, and control. It is here that the layers of oppression grew most twisted. For, in many households, enslaved women were forced into roles the mistress resented. They cooked, cleaned, nursed, and sometimes stood closer to the master than the wife herself. Such proximity bred suspicion. The mistress's authority was constantly tested by her own insecurities, which often translated into punishments against the enslaved. Lydia lived within this suffocating dynamic, her humanity dismissed, her worth reduced to labor, her every move subject to correction. The wedding that would one day serve as the stage for Lydia's vengeance was intended as a moment of triumph for the mistress. Draped in ceremony, gilded with music and ritual, it represented her elevation within society's eyes. Here was her crowning achievement, the proof of her power and refinement. Yet, even in this moment, the invisible labor of women like Lydia held the event together. The food, the preparation, the unseen toils, these were provided by the very hands despised and demeaned. And this irony could not be more bitter. The mistress sought honor in her union, but it was Lydia who carried the hidden power that day. Every command, every punishment, every reminder of ownership had carved deep scars into Lydia's soul. Now, the wedding would become more than a celebration. It would be remembered as the scene where an enslaved woman turned years of subjugation into a single, unforgettable act of defiance. The act did not rise out of sudden madness, but from years of torment pressed against her spirit. Every rebellion has a trigger, and Lydia's defiance was born from a life where dignity was stripped away, piece by piece. She lived in a world where every sunrise brought new commands, new humility, and new reminders that she was seen not as a woman, but as property. The constant weight of enslavement pressed on every aspect of her existence. Tasks were not requests but demands. enforced with sharp words or harsher blows. For Lydia, labor was endless and unbroken rhythm of toil that left no room for rest or choice. The cruelty was not only in the work, but in the stripping away of selfhood, where her body, her time, and even her silence belonged to someone else. This erosion of humanity was deliberate, designed to keep her bound in both body and spirit. Humiliation was its own form of violence. Lydia lived under the eyes of her mistress, whose authority reached into every detail of her life. She could be scolded for the smallest fault, punished for imagined slights, and reminded at every turn that her existence was at the mercy of another's will. Such degradation was not accidental. It was the daily mechanism of slavery, a system built to keep her powerless. Each insult, each punishment, added to the deep wound of being denied the simple recognition of personhood. Violence lurked as a constant threat. The lash, the slap, the tightening grip of control, all were reminders that rebellion carried heavy costs. But within that fear also lived the seed of resistance. For every blow, there was also a spark, a quiet defiance growing stronger. To live under such domination was to feel the pressure build like a storm behind closed doors, waiting for its release. Lydia's silence was not surrender. It was endurance, gathering force in the shadows. What her oppressors could not see was that every act of cruelty carried its own consequence. By denying her humanity, they sharpened her will. By stripping her dignity, they hardened her resolve. Slavery sought to crush the spirit, yet in Lydia it produced the opposite, a determination that one day she would strike back. The act itself, though extraordinary, was born of ordinary wounds, humiliation, labor, and control repeated until resistance became inevitable. The choice of the wedding night was no accident. This was not merely a gathering of family and wealth. It was the mistress's moment of triumph, a celebration of her elevation in society. Lydia's defiance turned that moment inside out. By striking then, she reached into the heart of her oppressor's legacy, staining what was meant to be pure with the mark of rebellion. The bridal night, so carefully chosen, became the stage where years of subjugation met their breaking point. What was meant to be a sanctuary of love and legacy was transformed, in a single act, into a chamber of smoke and ruin. The room that should have held whispers of vows instead filled with screams. The silks, the candles, the carefully chosen finery, all collapsed into the chaos. Lydia unleashed. The bridal chamber was the pride of the household, draped in imported fabrics, trimmed with ornaments that spoke of wealth and status. It was arranged as a stage where family honor would be displayed. Guests below raised their glasses, believing themselves secure in their world of privilege. Yet upstairs, Lydia chose her moment. Her hands carried no weapons of steel, only the resolve that had been sharpened by years of humiliation. In that intimate room, she lit the spark that would not be ignored. The fire did not begin with fury, but with a hiss, a small flicker that caught upon fabric. Flames climbed with the hunger of a thing long restrained, first licking the edges of curtains, then reaching higher, faster, until the room itself seemed to breathe with heat. Within seconds, the chamber transformed from a place of beauty to a furnace. Every painted wall, every polished piece of wood, became kindling for the rebellion that had taken form. The mistress, dressed in her gown of triumph, was caught in the center. The very garments that marked her as a bride turned into her chains of fire. Screams tore through the chamber, sharp enough to silence the music below. Guests froze, the joy of celebration cracking apart as smoke began to seep through the air. Above their heads, the night was unraveling. Lydia's act had pulled the veil away, showing what lay beneath the grandeur, fragility, fear, and the truth that no master was untouchable. Panic spread like the flames themselves. Servants rushed, guests stumbled, and the household descended into terror. The bridal chamber, once the symbol of control and order, was now a scene of collapse. Curtains fell in embers, the ceiling groaned, and the air filled with the choking weight of smoke. What had been built to shine as a display of aristocratic pride was undone in a matter of minutes. Lydia's defiance did not require armies or weapons-only fire, timed at the moment of greatest vulnerability. The weight of the act pressed into every corner of the estate. Those who saw the blaze would never forget it. The mistress's cries, echoing down the corridors, became the sound of reversal power turned against itself. Guests, who only moments earlier toasted wealth and union, now stumbled into the night, coughing, desperate, stripped of their composure. The chamber burned not just fabric and wood, but the illusion of invulnerability. For Lydia, this was the strike she had carried in silence. Not random, not reckless, but chosen with precision. By setting her mistress aflame in the bridal chamber, she pierced the very heart of her oppressor's legacy. The act was not only destruction, but declaration. Even in the deepest chamber of privilege, resistance could break through. When the smoke finally cleared, nothing of the room's splendor remained. The ashes told their story without need of words. Wealth could not shield cruelty forever, and celebration could turn to horror in a single night. Lydia's name, once buried under bondage, was now burned into memory. The bridal chamber, meant for union, had become her stage of revolt. The flames that consumed that room did not end with the bride. They spread in another way, igniting terror, fury, and whispers that would not die. The household, once a place of rigid order, was thrown into chaos the moment the smoke cleared. What had been a celebration ended as a night of disbelief. A wound cut deep into the heart of the slave-holding world. The immediate aftermath was nothing short of pandemonium. Guests who had gathered in their finest silks and coats stumbled out into the dark air, their eyes red from smoke, their voices shaking with shock. The music had stopped, the laughter silenced. All that remained was the sound of confusion boots pounding against wooden floors, servants rushing with buckets far too late, and the hollow cries of a family undone. The bridal chamber, the most sacred of spaces, had become the symbol of horror. For the enslaved, the fear was immediate and suffocating. They knew that fire did not only consume wood and fabric, it consumed the fragile line of safety they had balanced on. In their eyes was the knowledge that punishment would fall heavy, whether they had played any part or not. Whispers ran quickly in the quarters. Who had done it? Would the master unleash his wrath on all? In that silence after the fire, the enslaved carried both dread and a quiet, dangerous awe. Lydia's act was terrifying, yes, but it was also defiance unlike anything they had seen within those walls. Among the whites of the household, fury roared as hot as the flames had. The mistress's death was not simply a crime, it was a violation of ritual, of the very structure that held their world together. A bride, a symbol of continuity and legacy, destroyed in the moment meant to secure her family's standing. To them, it was not only murder, it was rebellion laid bare. If fire could strike here, in their most intimate chamber, what did that mean for the rest of their carefully ordered society? That question haunted every glance, every whisper, every clenched jaw in the smoke-filled aftermath. The silence that followed the chaos was its own kind of violence. Ash clung to the walls, the scent of ruin hung in the air, and no one dared speak too loudly. The enslaved moved carefully, their steps measured, their faces controlled, though their hearts raced. The whites spoke in hushed, trembling tones, anger mixing with something they would not admit, because deep down, they recognized the truth. This was not madness, but message. The fire had said, what words could not that bondage bred resistance? And no ceremony, no wealth, no title could guarantee safety. The household would never return to what it was before that night. Even after the ashes cooled, unease lingered in the very air. Doors were checked twice, glances sharpened with suspicion, and every sound in the dark carried weight. The shock waves of Lydia's act rippled far beyond the chamber, far beyond the household. They marked a reminder that the system itself was fragile, vulnerable to those it sought to control, and in that fragility, fear would never fully leave. Her act of fire had shattered the order of the household. But in the world of slavery, defiance never went unanswered. From the moment the flames died down, Lydia's fate was sealed. The society that thrived on submission could not allow her rebellion to stand. Her capture came swiftly, the weight of white authority closing in with the force of inevitability. There was no question of her guilt. The very ashes of the bridal chamber testified against her. Yet in Kentucky, as in all of the South, the trial of an enslaved woman was not about evidence or fairness. It was about making an example. Lydia was dragged before the machinery of law, but the outcome was already decided before she ever stepped into that space. The courts of slavery were never built for justice. They were instruments of fear, designed to show every other enslaved person what happened when the chain was defied. Her trial moved with ruthless efficiency. White faces filled the room, burning with outrage, determined that order be restored. The mistress had been a bride, a symbol of purity and lineage. To strike at her in the bridal chamber was to strike at the heart of the master class itself. That insult demanded vengeance, and vengeance would come cloaked in the language of law. The jury did not deliberate long. They did not need to. Lydia's voice, whatever she may have said, was swallowed by the verdict that had been waiting since the night of the fire. The sentence was severe, as everyone expected. It had to be. This was not just about punishing one woman, it was about warning thousands. The slaveholding world understood rebellion as a disease, and the cure was always terror. By condemning Lydia publicly, they sought to silence any whisper of resistance among the enslaved. The punishment was crafted not for her alone, but for all who might dare to imagine following in her steps. The scene of judgment was as deliberate as the act of fire had been. If Lydia had turned a wedding chamber into a stage of defiance, the court now turned her body into a stage of submission. The sentence was carried out with a swiftness meant to erase sympathy, to choke off any thought of courage before it could take root. In the eyes of her oppressors, she ceased to be a woman and became a symbol, a warning, branded into memory. Yet, even in punishment, something lingered that could not be erased. For the enslaved who watched or later heard the story, the terror was undeniable, but so was the mark of defiance. The system demanded silence, demanded fear, but Lydia's fire had already spoken. It had torn through the boundaries of the household and echoed beyond the courtroom's walls. Her judgment, meant to restore order, revealed instead the fragility of that order. It showed how much violence was required to keep a people in chains, how much cruelty was necessary to keep rebellion from spreading. Lydia's body was taken, her life extinguished, but her act had exposed the truth the masters feared most, that even in bondage, resistance could burn as fiercely as flame. Though her body was broken by punishment, her memory refused to be buried. 4 years after her death, her story lived in the air like a hushed rumor, carried between cabins, whispered in kitchens, and muttered in the fields where men and women bent beneath the lash of labor. Lydia's life was extinguished, but her defiance made her unforgettable. For the slaveholders of Kentucky, her name was heavy with dread. It stood as living proof of their darkest fear, that those bound in silence might one day rise in rebellion, not with open armies, but in the intimate space of the household, the very place they believed themselves most secure. Lydia had not struck in the fields or at the edge of the woods. She struck at the table, in the very heart of her master's home, and that act, more than any word of threat or shadow of escape, shook the system's fragile confidence. Her name became shorthand for treachery, a word spoken to remind other enslaved people of the terrible cost of defiance. But memory, like fire, is hard to control. Among the enslaved, Lydia's name carried a different weight. They could not speak of her openly, but in the dark corners where no overseer's eyes could reach, her story was remembered in another way. To some, she was a warning, a lesson in what happened to those who challenged the iron order. To others, she was something more, a spark of inspiration, proof that even in chains, a hand could reach upward and strike. Her act became a forbidden tale, half whispered like a prayer, half guarded like contraband, passed between those who needed to believe that power was not unshakable. Kentucky itself seemed to hold her ghost. The very soil bore the tension of her memory. Slaveholders walked more carefully, their fears sharpened by what had already been done. They told each other her name, as if repeating it could exorcise the danger, as if retelling her fall might scare others into submission. Yet in doing so, they kept her alive. Every warning carried her story further. Every caution spread her act wider. The irony was cruel. In their effort to stamp her out, they made her into legend. Among the enslaved, her name lived in two worlds, half demonized, half revered. To some, she was a shadow of doom, her punishment too terrible to forget. To others, she was a quiet kind of hero, not for survival, but for her refusal to bow. They could never honor her openly, never build her monument or write her name in stone, but in the spaces that mattered, in memory, in whispered words, in the hearts of those still bound, Lydia endured. She was both caution and inspiration, both warning and proof. In Kentucky, her story lingered like smoke after fire, difficult to see, but impossible to ignore. And even as years passed, her name refused to fade, haunting masters who feared her, and emboldening slaves who remembered that even the smallest act of defiance could leave an everlasting scar. Her act was born from chains, and it ended in fire. What happened in that household is not to be measured as triumph or simple wickedness. It is to be understood as the natural shadow cast by a system built on bondage. In a world where human beings were treated as property, violence did not come from nowhere. It was the consequence, written into slavery's very design. Every lash, every command, every stolen freedom piled weight upon the spirit. And when a spirit is pressed down long enough, when it is chained and silenced beyond all reason, fire waits inside. Lydia's act revealed that fire. It showed that slavery's order was never unshakable. Beneath the silence of the cabins, beneath the bowing heads and weary hands, rebellion was always smoldering. It could not be erased by punishment. It could not be silenced by terror. It lingered, waiting for the moment when the chains would meet the flame. To the slaveholders, her story was a nightmare given flesh. To the enslaved, it was a reminder that submission was not the whole story. Somewhere, even in the darkest of places, the human will to resist survived. Lydia's crime was terrible, but the system that birthed it was worse, and in her act, we see the cost of dehumanization laid bare. Slavery demanded silence, but Lydia answered with fire. And that answer tells us something essential about history. Oppression always breeds resistance. As we close her story, let us not mistake it for an isolated spark. Hers was one among countless acts, large and small, known and forgotten, through which enslaved men and women struck back against their chains. Some resisted by running, some by fighting, some by clinging fiercely to family and faith. Lydia's choice was darker, more violent, but it was born from the same place, a refusal to remain only a victim. Her story reminds us that history is not only the record of chains, but of blood spilled in defiance, of fire set against the night. Her name lingers still, not as triumph, not as tragedy alone, but as a haunting truth. It tells us that when people are reduced to property, rebellion will one day rise. It may come quietly, it may come in fury, but it will come. Lydia showed the cost of slavery's cruelty in the most intimate of ways, by turning the tools of survival into weapons of vengeance, and her memory forces us to confront the reality that the system itself created the violence it feared most. This story, like the chains that once rattled across Kentucky, leaves an echo, and it calls to us now. Remember Lydian, only for the punishment she faced, but for the fire she revealed, a fire born from bondage, a fire that slavery itself could not contain. If her name endures, it is because history cannot bury the truth. It does not only remember the chains, it remembers the blood and the fire shed to break them.